Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Monday, the 3rd of March, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway with Robert this morning. Robert, good morning. So this is interesting. Ray Dalio, I follow him pretty closely, mainly because he's been talking about debt crises, and back in 2016, he started talking about a potential civil war in the United States. He boiled that down to capitalists versus socialists. He said this is what the United States has to look forward to. Most recently, he also talked about a potential debt crisis within the next 3 years. What's going on?
Yeah, this was from an interview over the weekend, I think with Bloomberg's Odd Lots podcast, and he said that we're actually risking what he called a heart attack debt crisis within 3 years. Though he said he could give or take a year on his prediction and this is if the Trump administration does not start working to reduce the budget deficit.
Mm-hmm. So Dalio's written a number of books. One of those was Principles for Navigating the Changing World Order, or something to that effect. That was a big book in 22, and he talked about the United States. And one of the things he did is in that book is he conducted a study of world orders, how they rise, peak, decline, and ultimately collapse. And he was not very optimistic about the quote unquote rules-based Western-led international order. And he seems to think like that world order is coming to an end. It will be replaced by maybe a Chinese world order. But, also in that book, he was just not very optimistic about the future of the American fiscal situation. Ray Dalio was also last week on Tucker Carlson. It's worth a watch. One of the things that he said on that episode with Tucker is how artificial intelligence is going to change nearly everything, either directly or indirectly. And he said he doesn't really know if these big changes in AI are going to lead to authoritarianism, because that was Tucker's question. Is AI leading us to authoritarian social control by the government, or if it's going to lead to anarchy? And I guess, Robert, in the hand, if it led to anarchy, like state breakdown or state collapse or something like that, it would be because what tech companies are larger and more powerful than the government, or it would enable the average U.S. citizen or average citizen, I guess, around the world to do more, kind of assuming government authority. I'm not really sure what the case for anarchy is. Have you heard anything like that yet?
No, not specifically in the term of anarchy, but it does remind me of, I think we've talked a lot about this Federal Reserve paper not Federal Reserve, the Bureau of Economic Development or Bureau of Economic Research paper that talked about how AI could usher in like a new economic paradigm. And that might be where he's headed with that, is that if that new economic paradigm means that states aren't ahead on the AI race yet, it could, start lowering state authority, basically state sovereignty, and put that in the hands of whoever does control those AI, which you could end up being the tech sector.
Mm-hmm. I was talking to my dad this weekend, and he told me that we were talking about this topic, and he said he was watching Glenn Beck, and essentially, and I guess Glenn Beck was asking Grok some of these other questions, asking AI about the future of AI, and basically Grok said, "There's no way to tell." And this is something that Elon Musk has also said. AI advancement is just moving so rapidly that we really can't anticipate the level of change that we're going to see. And Musk says all this stuff's going to happen a lot sooner than most people realize. And I mean, realistically, it really does kind of sound like in 2 or 3 years, we're just going to be pummeled by massive daily change through AI. What a time to be alive, as the meme goes. All right, Robert. Hey, let's circle back on this. This is an interesting topic, and we probably need to do some more work here, but we'll have to do it later. Let's move on here, because one of the things that President Trump's been doing is firing a lot of people, and apparently the Supreme Court is going to hear one of these cases that really sounds to me like it's going to be pivotal for the future of the administration.
Yeah, this was a ruling over the weekend from the federal district courts. And this was after Trump fired Office of Special Counsel Chief Hampton Dellinger. And the judge said not only that the act that established his office, which was the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act, was constitutional, but also that he has to be reinstated. And if she had ruled the other way, she said this would, quote, give Trump a constitutional license to bully executive branch officials. And yeah, I think this is likely headed to the Supreme Court. There's from what I understand, reading legal analysis of this, there's a lot of grounds for appeal by the Trump administration. They could even seek something like an emergency appeal. But I think overall, that the Trump administration this is probably a decision they wanted, and they might be trying to overturn legal precedent. It's a court case, I think it's from 1935, called Humphreys Executor v. U.S., and this established these for-cause firing protections for federal or what they call constitutional officers at these independent agencies, like the Office of Special Counsel. And it's also, I think, further along, the Trump administration could also start arguing that the act that establishes office is unconstitutional. And what's important about that is that would actually, I think, allow him to consolidate a couple of agencies, important ones. And this was a post-Watergate scandal bill that broke up the U.S. Civil Service Commission into 3 agencies, including the Office of Personnel Management. And I think if they do make this case and it does, fall in their favor at the Supreme Court, we could see Trump make some major moves at the federal level and consolidate some of these agencies back into one agency, and that would give him more direct control over the executive branch.
Mm-hmm. Robert, let's come back to this SCOTUS thing, the Supreme Court. One of the things we've talked about previously is, you said pretty succinctly, like a week ago or so, that Chief Justice John Roberts wants to protect the legitimacy of the courts. And it seems to me that he has done so in a manner that kind of disregards, I think, real legal opinions. I go back to that commerce trial they had, where basically Chief Justice John Roberts said that the Commerce Department cannot include a question on the 2020 census asking about if whoever fills out if respondents are legal in the country legally or illegally. And he said it's not because it violates a law, but because you didn't follow some process or something. So therefore you can't do it. And the Commerce Department tried to get a last minute stay, and apparently they wouldn't hear it. And Robert, it seems to me that if the Chief Justice is concerned about legitimacy, he should be making rulings based on the law. And it really seems to me that the Supreme Court is being partial to itself, trying to protect its legitimacy, but actually, in a way, delegitimizes itself by having these kind of political fairness. It's like they're a referee between Democrats and Republicans. And it's like Robert says, well, we ruled for this party last time, so we're going to rule for this party this time. So we appear impartial. And they're really being partial to themselves and not partial to the law. And so I bring this up because this is maybe the third Supreme Court case that could be heard that will have a major impact on the future of the Trump administration, really the Trump agenda, what they're trying to do. Is this a case, or do you think we're going to see protests against the Supreme Court if they rule in favor in Trump? If they rule in the Trump administration's favor on these 3 cases, I guess alternatively, what could the Supreme Court do to its legitimacy if they use some of these, fairness approaches to these rulings instead of ruling on the law?
Well, in the first case with the protests, I think that's basically guaranteed. It maybe not like physical protests at the Supreme Court justices' homes. After the whole Brett Kavanaugh thing, and I think there was a guy who tried to kill him that was caught by the U.S. Marshals. But it's definitely, there will be a lot of political pressure from the Democrats put on the Supreme Court. Messaging campaigns, saying that the court is starting to become illegitimate, and threats under the next Democrat administration to pack the court or whatever. But on the second question, I think Roberts is in a catch-22 here, as he has effectively made himself that political referee. And so if he does, he wants to protect the legitimacy of the court, but no matter what decision he makes, somebody's going to see it as illegitimate at this point. If he sides with the Trump administration, he goes through that whole Democrat pressure campaign. If he sides against the Trump administration, well, the people who support Trump and the Trump administration are obviously going to see it as illegitimate, especially if he pulls, like you talked about earlier, they use the Administrative Procedure Act a lot for that, to say, well, what you did was technically legal, but you didn't follow step 32A in this 50-step process in the Administrative Procedure Act, so we're going to side against you. And that's going to hurt his legitimacy with Republicans, and maybe that kind of puts us a little notch closer to a conflict between the court and the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then worst case scenario here, let's say the Supreme Court does come out and rule that lower level federal courts can issue an injunction and completely stop the executive branch in its tracks on literally anything. And if the Supreme Court rules on this and sides with these lower federal courts, then I guess any activist judge anywhere is going to be able to stop the presidential administration. Last question here. Is this, I mean, this is obviously setting the Trump administration up for a, the court has made its ruling now, let them come in and enforce it here. Just from a low intensity conflict perspective, I'm somewhat concerned about this because the quote unquote anti-fascist, the left is going to claim that this is a fascist action on behalf of Trump. Is this something realistically we could be looking at before the midterms?
Possibly. I think looking back at the historical times this has happened, like Andrew Jackson, I think we talked about last week, that really, a lot of that conflict around that time took years to see. Like leading up to the Civil War, for example, we saw like a decade plus of political conflict and actually armed conflict between the two different major sides of the political divide. So we might not see any kind of major conflict like that where it comes to something like direct actions from either side, and until after even the next presidential election.
Mm-hmm. All right. Last question here. Are we expecting the Supreme Court to make these rulings before the midterms?
I think so. They would, their next session, I think they will take up some of these cases. There's also, I think, a possibility they could wait for more of these decisions on similar issues to trickle up or get final decisions from the district judges and try to consolidate some of these cases together, so they're not trying to decide on, I think it's now over 90 cases.
And then so the Supreme Court, do they have I know they have a June, I guess a June session where they announce their rulings. Do they have one in March also?
I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Okay. All right. That's fine. All right. Thanks, Robert. Let's go ahead and move into our roll-ups here. Looking down on the border, the Pentagon, what is a striker unit they deployed now to the border?
Yeah, Striker Brigade Combat Team and also an Aviation Support Battalion. And they're going down to the southern border, and the Pentagon said that they are expected to arrive in the coming weeks. And then I also saw some interesting data on border encounters. And so in February, border encounters were down to just over 8,000. And this is from January, where it was almost 30, and then an average over 2024 of 125,000 border encounters a month.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty incredible what you can do when you actually try to implement border security, Robert. Thanks for that. Let's go ahead and move on to Jared for today's global roll-up items. A quick update from Israel and Gaza. What's going on?
Yes, so they did not, Israel and Hamas did not reach a deal to extend the ceasefire over the weekend, and in response, Israel cut all humanitarian aid access to Gaza this morning. Moving over to Japan, Japan's chief cabinet secretary announced that Japan will not attend a UN conference on abolishing nuclear weapons because Japan values nuclear deterrence as a significant measure for Japan's sovereignty, and he said that this would send the wrong message. Attending would send the wrong message to the United States.
Hey, Jared, let me interrupt real quick. Japan has talked about building its own nuclear weapons as a deterrent against China. Is this an indicator that they're going to pursue that course of action?
I think it will play into it. Their current prime minister is very in favor of developing their own nuclear weapons, and at this point, I think it's fair to say that Japan is just kind of waiting for the Hiroshima crowd to die off before they move on to it, because they're the big players going, hey, we don't want nuclear anything here. But it's only a matter of time, I think, before Japan switches sides over to we need nukes just because of the threat from China.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you.
Okay. And the Australian government think tank that we've covered quite a few times, ASPI, they are recommending that their government proactively work with the United States on critical mineral extraction and processing to enhance Australia's strength in the alliance with America and break both of their reliance on China for these minerals. And ASPI even went out of their way to denote that this was a direct response to the U.S.-Ukraine mineral deal that fell through. The Venezuelans are up to some fun stuff down south. The Guyanese president announced this weekend that a Venezuelan Coast Guard vessel harassed several Guyanese offshore oil platforms in the Stabroek field as part of an ongoing maritime territorial dispute between the nations. And Stabroek produces a lot of oil. It's about 650,000 barrels a day and about 1 billion cubic feet of natural gas as well.
All right, and let's wind up in Mexico here. So you note in this morning's report that these crackdowns, the Mexican crackdowns on the cartels, actually started back in October. Was that the case where it seemed to me, Robert, and actually I talked to some Mexican nationals about this. The DEA basically not a literal drug deal, but they essentially cut this deal where they had one cartel go and kidnap a rival cartel leader, fly them to the El Paso airport where DEA agents were miraculously awaiting this guy, and then they arrested him. Basically, it sounds like to me the United States used cartels to kidnap a cartel leader and extradite him extrajudiciously to the United States. I believe that was in October. More recently, I think we have seen the Mexican government crack down on cartels. This seems to be in direct response to President Trump. What's going on?
Absolutely. The Mexican officials are reporting that they've arrested 900 Sinaloa cartel members since October alone, and that's just Sinaloa, not the rest of the cartels. I didn't have any hard numbers on those, but presumably quite a few more. And they have seized as much fentanyl in the last 5 months as they did in the entire previous year. So that's an enormous crackdown on cartels and fentanyl. And noting that it started in October, it indicates to me that they've been working at this probably with a prospective Trump administration for a while now. Mm-hmm. And several cartel members speaking anonymously reported that they were just trying to survive. They were heading into hiding and had moved fentanyl labs, which caused them to reduce fentanyl production.
Mm-hmm. It sounds to me like Mexico does not want these tariffs going through, which is actually, it should make us, I think, somewhat optimistic that Scott Bessent and President Trump are going to remove the threat of these tariffs, maybe altogether, if Mexico continues going after some of these cartels.
Absolutely. That's frankly that if all of this is exactly as the Mexican officials are reporting, then yes, I'm very optimistic that this will actually greatly improve Mexican and American relationships. And lastly, we are moving back over to Europe in response to the Ukraine mineral deal argument, which everybody saw over on Friday. Zelensky met with several European leaders. The two big things to come out of this: Prime Minister Starmer from the UK announced a coalition of the willing with UK boots on the ground, and French President Macron proposed a 1-month ceasefire deal instead of that. Now, this shows a bit of a split. It seems like Europe doesn't know which way it's going to go, but fighting a war with Russia seems very unlikely, including putting boots on the ground in Ukraine.
I saw where some Germans over the weekend called for, I guess, NATO intervention. They wanted to close Ukrainian airspace to Russian military jet incursions. I don't know how they don't understand that it's probably going to lead to a World War III. This is exactly what President Trump warned Zelensky about. I think Zelensky knows this. We have assumed that Zelensky actually has wanted for 2 years now, plus, I guess almost 3 years now, 3 years for NATO intervention and for essentially a World War III to save Ukraine. It seems like Europe says they're headed towards there. I'm not sure that they have the ability to prosecute that kind of war. Jared, just a quick question for clarification. When Keir Starmer said boots on ground, he's talking about sending British soldiers to Ukraine to do what? To enforce
to secure a post-war Ukraine, but this doesn't. You would have to achieve a post-war Ukraine in the first part. One thing I sorry, I kind of skipped over here. He did say that even with all that, they would still need American backing. So that's pretty much dead on arrival, but nevertheless, he intends to move forward with it. I don't know how he intends to move forward with it. That is his stated intention. There's a lot of stuff to point to. This doesn't look like it's going to go the way he thinks it's going to go, and I think President Macron is charting the path that Europe is going to take, where they're going to try for a ceasefire, maybe without America, and then go toward, okay, well, what does peace in Ukraine really look like?
Mm-hmm. All right. Hey, last thing I saw, I didn't catch who this Ukrainian was, but I guess I think he's some minister of parliament there. He was talking about Ukraine because Zelensky was spurned by President Trump. He was saying that the Ukrainians need to pivot and start talking to China about coming in to develop their industry, including these critical materials. I'm not sure how serious that is. I kind of doubt it because I don't think the Europeans would allow that to happen.
I will double check. I believe Ukraine is one of the few European nations actually part of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. So that may be a bit more serious. I'll take a much deeper look into that today. I didn't catch that this weekend.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that. And then we'll bring Robert back on to talk about our last item of the day. Robert, we've been talking about this for several weeks now. What is the future of the Democratic Party? There is one faction that says we need to stop doing all the trans stuff. We need to stop the far left social policies, and we need to moderate. And then we've also seen from the left wing of the Democrat Party that says they have said essentially the Democratic Party is not going to be the vehicle through which they usher in this left wing revolution, and maybe they should go and strike a deal with DSA or CPUSA or the socialist or communist parties. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about what the third way was doing last month.
So they held a retreat for Democratic lawmakers, strategists, and staffers last month. And the idea was to outline a political strategy for what they called a Democratic comeback. And just for some context, Third Way was founded by Matt Bennett and some other people heavily involved in Democratic politics. Matt Bennett actually worked on the Dukakis campaign in 1988 and for the Clinton campaigns as well. So he's been in Democratic politics for a long time. And they put out, well, I shouldn't say put out, a document. The strategy document was leaked to the media, to Politico, I think with the idea that Politico was going to publish it. But it had some interesting ideas in here, and some that what they call, they say they should embrace patriotism, community, and traditional American imagery, get out of elite circles, and I think really hilariously get into real communities, e.g. tailgates, gun shows, local restaurants, and churches. And then another important point, probably to me, the point of greatest possible failure if Democrats do take up this strategy, is reducing far left influence and infrastructure in the party. So because I think this event was held under what's called Chatham House rules, so no names are actually attached to this. So it's not clear, which Democratic Party leaders participated. But I think this leak is likely intended as a message to the broader Democratic Party lawmakers and party operatives for the direction that the moderate wing of the Democratic Party should, in their view, should be headed ahead of the 2026 midterms. Because we've shown that the moderate Democrats have a lot more support among their voter base. But I think this idea of, in this one, removing this far left infrastructure and influence from the party is probably where they're going to have a major hang up, because there is a lot of influence in a lot of this organizing, the DNC, even like the recent DNC officer elections. You can see that there's still a heavy far left and progressive influence on the direction the party's headed. And I think it's going to meet a very stiff resistance from what remains of the far left and progressive parts of the Democratic coalition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is interesting because this plays directly into what we were talking about on Friday, which is if the Democratic Party does moderate their position, they're going to alienate the left wing of their party. This is something that Will Menaker said back in January. Will's the co-host of a socialist democratic podcast called Chapo Trap House. And he said the liberal left alliance is over in American politics. And the Bernie wing of the party had this political insurgency, basically trying to wrestle control away of the party from moderates. He said that insurgency has been defeated, and we've heard from Democratic Socialists of America, Communist Party USA, presumably other far left parties, that their voter rolls, or their not voter rolls, their membership is surging right now because the left wing, I think, probably has become disillusioned with the Democrat Party. So, bottom line here, the third way has been a counterweight to kind of the left wing of the party. They've been a very moderating voice. Do you see third way having a huge impact and actually charting the course for the future of the party?
Well, I think that's part of this leak is to get more moderate Democrats to have some kind of unified message, because I think that's been a big problem for the moderate wing so far. As far as internal politics, they still have a significant infrastructure advantage over the far left and progressive parts of the coalition. Just they have the donor class, they have the voter support. But I think this is an attempt to get some kind of unified platform. And while I think the going to gun shows and churches stuff is funny, it wasn't that long ago that Democrats did that Democrats were strong in the South and among rural populations. And over time, they've just consolidated into a much more urban voter base, versus a rural voter base. And I don't think there's necessarily anything stopping them from at least attempting to reverse that again, except for, this far left and progressive influence in their political infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, there is a coming political fight here happening for sure. Thanks for that update, Robert. We are going to get to a couple of questions here. Do you see any similarities to what is happening with Brazil's Supreme Court actions, Robert? So the Brazil, I guess this is in reference to what the Brazilian Supreme Court ruled, how they ruled on Bolsonaro. I guess that's the context of this question.
Well, I think recently they had a ruling on Rumble and then X and all that. And my take on how I understood this question was basically, are they going through a similar kind of political fight over the court? And I think in this case, the Brazilian Supreme Court, from my outsider's perspective, has taken a side. And it's with the current president, not Bolsonaro, not this sort of global populist, conservative movement.
Mm-hmm. All right. I guess I don't follow Brazil day to day. All right. And then there's another question here on this. Keir Starmer's pulled together European leadership to cobble together a Ukrainian peace plan that still seems to have NATO membership for Ukraine as an element. Is that a non-starter? Thoughts? Jared, correct me if I'm wrong. NATO requires unanimous consent for a session, correct? Okay.
Sure.
So there's an approximately 0% chance that Ukraine becomes a member of NATO. Kind of the bottom line.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, that's going to do it. Everyone, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for your support. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.